For my presentation, I will be discussing the details of my research and my literature review on prenatal opioid exposure and its effects on the fetal brain. And just in case anyone doesn't know what that means, it's basically when opioids or just any type of drugs, whether prescribed or illicit, are used by a pregnant woman during pregnancy. And in this research, I was looking at the effects on the brain of the fetus and how that develops throughout adolescence and as the child grows over time. So, and also, if I use the word POE during my presentation, just know I'm referring to prenatal opioid exposure. It's a little bit long, so I don't want to waste too much time on that. But, well, next slide. But I guess I'll just start off by some background information and just like a little bit of history and like what we're working with here. So in Canada and all the provinces, the prevalence of self-reported opioid use during pregnancy has reached 1.4% in the past few years. And out of the 1.1% of pregnant women that use opioids during pregnancy, an unknown ratio of them are prescribed. So it's a little bit tricky here because we don't have a clear picture of what that looks like. It's an unknown ratio. And I also said self-reported opioids. So we don't know of the people or the pregnant women that are using opioids and are not reporting it. So it's a very tricky topic, and it's also very relevant, and it's become very relevant to the past few years with the opioid crisis and like how we've been dealing with it. And it's definitely it's an issue when it comes to pregnant women consuming it, or I guess using it during pregnancy. So opioids, obviously, they leave very negative effects on the fetal brain during maternity. And because it is difficult to isolate the effects of POE exposure on the infant brain due to maternal and environmental factors, confirmed effects of POE are not yet well established, unfortunately. So for example, if during the conduction of research, there is insula shrinkage, so insula is a region in the brain, if there's a shrinkage and the mother is also using opioids during pregnancy, we might think, oh, it might be because of the opioids, but in reality, it might be because of environmental factors or some other drugs or I guess like medicines that the mother is using during pregnancy. So it's for sure a little bit tricky. And I guess like when you are doing scientific research, you need to isolate the variable that you don't want to look at the one that you do want. But in this case, it just has not been done very successfully. However, POE has been shown to be a key contributor of neurodevelopmental dysfunctionalities in all the brain regions, and upon entering the brain through the placenta, opioids proceed to affect the whole brain. So they're quite contagious, and they just kind of spread out to all the little, I guess, like neurovascular regions and just all the different structures of the brain in general. And POE may also lead to neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, or NOWS, which is characterized by altered clinical, neurodevelopmental, cognitive, and behavioral difficulties. And I guess before I get into the actual research and like the details of it, I'll just kind of touch on some few important key methods that I used throughout the conduction of my research. So because the topic of POE and its effects on the fetal brain is relatively fresh and is also currently a hot topic in debate and has been for the past few years, again, because of the opioid crisis as well, it's important to take note of information that has been confirmed by multiple researchers when you are conducting research on it or writing a literature review, to make sure that the other variables other than solely opioids that affect the results during the conduction of research are less apparent in the results. So for example, throughout my research, if let's say one study said that the insula underwent significant volume shrinkage because of POE, I would not only rely on that source, I would look for some other information that carry the same content and other resources to confirm that yes, the insula really does decrease in volume. I also just generally chose peer-reviewed articles and ones with higher impacts, as well as higher citation numbers, because those tend to be the most credible sources. But I also did come across very trustable and credible blog posts that were posted by credible universities around the world. And I believe Johns Hopkins posts very good information as well. So if you guys want to, you can definitely go ahead and look into that later. But I guess to get into the more generic introduction, but also providing some other information about POE, if you could please switch to slide Yeah, thanks. So the effects of POE are observed across the central nervous system from the cerebral cortex, which is essentially it's like the layer that covers the entirety of the brain, and I'll show you guys what that looks like in the next few slides. But it's like it's almost like the skin of the brain kind of, but it covers the entirety of the brain. So like all the different regions. So it spreads through that, which is very risky because it covers the whole brain. So it can obviously reach all the different structures. And it also reaches the opioid receptors, which are the mu, kappa, and delta receptors, and they essentially deal with mood change or emotion and things like that. And during pregnancy, opioids make their way into the brain from the ventral tegmental area and the placenta after entering the nervous system through the reward pathway. And the reward pathway, and I'll show you that later as well after this slide, but it essentially covers a lot of the structures of the brain that deal with reward feelings. So, and it really is like, I can't really explain it with any other synonyms. It's like when you have a rewarding feeling, when, like for example, if you got like a 97% on a test that you thought you were going to fail, and you get that like fulfillment feeling, the reward system deals with that type of feelings, and that is unfortunately dysfunctioned to a great extent because of POE during maternity and throughout adolescence. And the drugs proceed to the prefrontal region, so that would be like the front of the brain. So if this is cerebellum, that would be like the front of the brain, and it spreads to that part. It goes to the amygdala, striatum, thalamus, and also the insula, as we touched on earlier. And the negative effects of POE have also been shown to proceed to the spinal cord as well. So apart from the brain itself, the spinal cord is also affected, which I will show you later as well. And as mentioned, opioids proceed to the fetus through the mu, kappa, and delta receptors, which are responsible for the determination of mood and reward processing, as well as the reward system, obviously. And the reward system, again, including the neural structures included in it. So it's quite a bit of a mouthful, but the anterior cingulate cortex, the orbital frontal cortex, the ventral striatum, the ventral pallidum, and the midbrain dopamine neurons experience a considerable amount of malfunctioning. And of course, the structures that encompass these receptors are also affected. So again, a bit of a mouthful, but the cerebral cortex, which I said covers the entirety of the brain, the thalamus, hypothalamus, which are closer to the midbrain region, periaqueductal grave, and I'll show you all that later as well. Interpeduncular nucleus and the median raphe, the dorsal root ganglion, the spinal cord, and also in the supraspinal regions and the periphery. So it's quite a bit, but it just shows how scary the effects of POE can be during maternity and so on and so forth. And regarding the link between the neuroanatomical features of the brain, the nucleus accumbens in the ventral striatum, putamen and caudate nucleus in the dorsal striatum are also included in the reward system. So because of this link, the effects of opioids and like the different compounds from the drugs also spread to those parts as well, because like the whole brain is linked, obviously. So it just spreads throughout the whole brain again. And just for some effects, so this leads to interference with the neural activity related to movement, reward, the conjunction of both movement and reward, speech articulation, so maybe stuttering or struggling to find words, or just like not being able to speak properly, linguistic ability, so language, possible, I guess like memory loss when it comes to language and words, stimulated fractions of addiction, so the child can also be addicted because the fetus will be consuming the drugs as the mother is also consuming it, and it obviously goes to the brain as well as cognitive functioning, memory, motivation, and emotions. So it's quite a bit, but it's very contagious. And then in the next slide, just like some pictures. So the reward pathway, the top left corner, you can see it spreads from kind of like above the brainstem, but then it goes to the midbrain, which is that like the middle part that kind of has like a different color, and then it just goes through the prefrontal regions and the frontal regions. So this picture shows the different parts of the reward pathway, but also the path that the drugs will be taking when spreading throughout the brain. As well as the bottom part, so the frontal lobe, like I said, is the front part of the brain. The thalamus, it's like the part where like the color is a little bit different, so a bit darker. Hypothalamus, they're all close to the midbrain, the dorsal striatum, and preaqueductal gray, and obviously the spinal cord as well, which is not included in the brain, obviously, but it is a part of the nervous system. So they're all linked. That's why it spreads so easily. And I guess, well, for the next slide, I mean, I could call this slide and this part of my presentation the discussion part, but I would rather call it common trends, because going back to what I said about finding research that is confirmed by multiple sources, the information that I will be discussing today and that I've been discussing the past few minutes, I guess, they're all confirmed information, and they're common trends that you would notice in research, in the very few researches that have been done on this topic, because again, it's very fresh, so there aren't that many articles, unfortunately. But according to a few studies, reduced basal ganglia volumes are observed due to POE, which results in behavioral difficulties, and I'll show you guys where that is in the next slide. But the basal ganglia is responsible for motor functioning, habits, learning, and emotions, and just any volume alterations of the basal ganglia in general may influence the functionalities mentioned. So any part of it that is affected in terms of volumes, it will be affected in terms of motor functioning, habits, learning, and emotion. And then I guess in addition, the frontal, subcortical, and frontotemporal limbic pathway. So it's almost like when you say like north-south, northwest, northeast. So that's basically like the frontal region, but like the different dimensions of it, I guess you could say. So those regions are also altered in terms of functionality and maybe even volume in most cases. And while the entirety of the brain volume is reduced to a significant extent, these effects are also seen. And this obviously results in further alteration regarding the structural and functional connectivity of the brain. And there was this particular research that concluded that infants that have been exposed to POE or that have had POE in the womb, they tend to have an increased cerebral blood flow, or CBF in short, compared to those that have not been exposed to it. And this severs their NOWS diagnosis, which is the neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome that I talked about earlier. And that also leads to a lot of behavioral and cognitive dysfunctionalities. And the insula has also been shown to be affected, but it is unclear to what extent and how specifically it is affected, because with the so little research that has been done on this topic and so little amount of articles that have been published on it, the insula specifically has not been really observed that closely. But there have been tracks of decreased connectivity to the sensomotor cortex and at increased functional insular connectivity to the frontal cortex. And obviously that is not good in any case. So when it's not functioning like it should, and when the connections are not as proper as they should be, it obviously leads to further difficulties and alterations. And furthermore, hippocampal volumes are increased. So the hippocampus region of the brain, it's enlarged, which leads to poor memory function in children that were diagnosed with POE. And just for some more specific type of drugs, so prenatal heroin and phenobarbital manifest also affect the hippocampus in terms of cholinergic receptor levels, because their maturation is also disrupted, which again causes issues with learning and memory. And notably, if the VEP from an infant with POE is considered, which essentially VEP it's like a numbering system. It's like a test used to measure the cohesion of the optical pathways of the eyes to the brain's occipital lobe. So if that from an infant with POE is considered, it's noticeable that there are lower amplitudes, altered morphology, and prolonged peak times. And interestingly enough, research has shown that POE can also lead to the development of a far less interesting disease, which is called torticollis. And it's a painful chronic neurological condition which just causes the neck to uncontrollably turn to different directions, which is really inconvenient, and it's quite painful as well. So, and that can again develop throughout adolescence or just any period of time in the child's life, I guess you could say, after the child is born. So we don't even know when exactly it happens, which makes it even more scary. And again, so the pictures, just to explain a little bit more, so the amygdala and the hippocampus. So again, the hippocampus is, its volume is shrunken. So it's just kind of like this little lobe here. And then like down in the left part of the this slide, you can see the cerebral cortex again, so the entirety of the brain in terms of like the skin of the brain, the frontal lobe, and then the insula is just kind of like, it's like underneath that little part there, and then the periaqueductal gray, and also they're not on the surface of the brain. Obviously, they're inside, but I couldn't really find any like better diagrams to show the actual regions. And by the way, all of these were taken from so UBC's medical school for the neuroscience part. They have like a really good website that shows 3D pictures of the brain, and like you can really like zoom in. So that's where I got the pictures from. And also like the basal ganglia on the right part. So it's not one specific brain structure, but rather it's like a whole region. So as you can see, like I've selected it with like the red line. So it's a whole region, and when that's obviously shrunken, it also leads to the entirety of the brain to be smaller in size, which is just it just results in further difficulties like the ones that I explained, so behavioral, functional, and cognitive. And the next slide, I thought that this was important to touch on. It's not necessarily about the research itself, but it's important to for sure, I guess, consider the animal testing part of researchers like this in this particular research and the challenges that are associated with it. So it's important to note that while animal studies have the capability to showcase essential dynamics of the neurological side effects of POE, they do not have the most accurate representation of the human body, because the human body and like the human brain in particular is just so complex, so many different parts to it, so many things that have not yet been explored, even though it's just like one body structure. It's just so complex, and the human mind, just everything in general, which this factor is a part of the reason why the accuracy of certain neurological effects in animals are still being debated, and the whole effects in general of POE are still being debated. But throughout my research, there are instances of data, or I guess you could say my whole research is an instance of data gathered from the observations made from POE effects throughout human adolescence that give an accurate picture of POE side effects. So also with that confirming method that I talked about, this also really helped out with, I guess, finding information that you can, I guess, trust to be credible. So, however, animal models have replicated symptoms observed in infants and children prenatally exposed to opioids, which makes these studies important for better understanding of the underlying mechanisms involved. And the next slide. So just to kind of, I guess, like close off the presentation, before I go on to talk about my experience with Talaria, I would like to talk about some solutions and some challenges that I've also touched on previously, but it's for sure important to acknowledge that factoring out it's like, I cannot stress this enough, factoring out other components like environmental influence to achieve the perfect results when looking at the effects of specific drugs, especially when they're specific, like heroin, methadone, etc., on the human brain is for sure a challenge. And especially because you're working with something that obviously throughout maternity, there's just so many different components involved. Like if you're doing like a chemistry experiment or research or whatever, you have a lot more domination and control over the different, I guess, like elements that you put into your research. But when we're talking about maternity and pregnancy and the fetal brain, like there's just so many different things involved, like so many different other medicines that the mother could be consuming that will affect the results of your research. So like there has to be, or there should be more work done on, I guess, factoring out those elements to achieve the most perfect results. But scientists are obviously working towards that, but it's currently a very huge challenge. But of course, effects such as reduced cell volumes, hyperconnectivity, and hypoconnectivity in white matter tracts, which white matter tracts are they're essentially the it's like the matter inside neurons that work with sending signals. So it's almost like it conducts like the different like messages that your brain wants to send to other like body structures and so on and so forth. so hypoconnectivity and hyperconnectivity, which is like basically when the connectivity of white matter tracts is either increased or decreased. So these and other damages that are repeatedly mentioned in studies can for sure be concluded to be solely as a result of POE, because multiple studies and multiple researchers have seen this. And the effects that are seen later on throughout adolescence also confirm that these effects are because of POE. And other challenges that I noticed some researchers were talking about, like in their articles, was having small sample sizes, which again contributes to making specific observations less accurate, because you have less data and it's not as well-rounded, which makes it difficult to make something like a generic result for everyone. But again, with multiple studies confirming similar results, it's possible to identify common effects of POE. And in terms of avoiding the issue at hand, to begin with, the use of illicit opioids during pregnancy must be checked throughout maternity. So it is the doctor and the clinic's job to do that, because it just creates all these different dysfunctionalities, and it should for sure be looked into. And this might not entirely, but partially avoid the risks POE brings to the fetus, but it's definitely, it will be effective. And in addition, prescribed opioids are also best to be avoided as much as possible during the course of maternity. And I researched some other substitutes that could be used, and if applicable, ones such as acetaminophen or aspirin or ibuprofen should be used as painkillers, because opioids are essentially, especially for labor as well, they're used for painkillers and some other purposes as well, obviously, but these could be potential substitutes. And that's all I have to say here about POE and my research itself. But to close off the presentation, I would like to just like kind of talk about my Talaria experience a little bit. So I would like to just start off by, she's not here today, but to thank my mentor for being so supportive, helpful, and so responsive throughout the program. I just remember during our first meeting, she was showing me like 3D designs of the brain and like on the UBC website, and my eyes were seriously lit up. Like this was my first ever experience with such a tangible feeling. I wasn't able to work in a lab, obviously, but just like going into the depth of this topic was just beautiful, and I will be forever thankful for all the beautiful things that my mentor taught me and showed me. And I obviously appreciate all of her mentorship and guidance. And I would also like to thank, she's also not here today, but Vanya Amani, Norsan, and Alice Lee for making my Talaria experience more enjoyable and manageable. They always answered my questions and checked in on me. Even when I was panicking, I would bother them, and they would answer my questions and I would calm down. So thank you guys for that. I was unfortunately not able to attend the events or most of the panels because of my schedule, but I did really appreciate the friendly environment of our Discord server and how helpful everyone there was. And I would not have been able to have the most enjoyable experience of my life in terms of delving into the realm of my dreams, aka neuroscience, without Talaria. So I'm thankful for this amazing opportunity.